Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 23rd of June of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kiev because we have a lot of very interesting updates from this area. The most important is that the Russians carry out another massive missile and drone strike all over the capital of Ukraine, the city of Kiev. As a result of this attack, the Russians managed to destroy lots of Ukrainian facilities. At least this was reported by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. The Ukrainians were using these facilities to produce drones and to produce missiles. You know that this is very interesting situation because this is not the first object that was destroyed by the Russians. Almost every single week the Russians destroy 5, 4, even sometimes 10 different military facilities that Ukrainians use to produce drones and missiles. It seems that Ukrainians managed to create dozens or even hundreds of them all over the entire territory of Ukraine, which is very interesting, and obviously the Ukrainians have a potential, but the question is why do they need this potential? Because obviously not to conduct ceasefire or the peaceful settlement. And today we got another very interesting article and several statements that were made by the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, General Sisky. He stated that the army's transition to a core structure will allow counteroffensive action to begin in the future. He didn't specify when exactly the Ukrainians are going to counterattack, but obviously this might happen very soon. And obviously the Ukrainians are not going to counterattack during the winter period of time. Most likely they're going to do this in the second part of summer, somewhere in July or August, and they will have a very short window of opportunities until obviously October or November, and then the Ukrainians would be forced to stop. Anyway, let's wait and see, but obviously we can say that Ukrainians are preparing themselves before something big and something huge. Currently, the main task and the purpose of Ukrainians to stabilize the situation along the line of combat contact in the area of original offensive of the Russian forces in the Donbass direction, and most likely then the Ukrainians will try to do something, and probably once again with the purpose to answer deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation. And when talking about the borderline between Russia and Ukraine, there is just one area left where both the Russians and the Ukrainians didn't carry out anything in the past, and we are talking about the area between the Chernihiv area, Sumy region, and the Bryansk region of the Russian Federation. So we expect that in the future, in the very near future, either the Russians or the Ukrainians would use this area with the purpose to attack each other. And most likely we are talking about the Ukrainian side. They will try to do something, and the question is whether the Russians are ready for this or they don't. Now let's discuss the situation along the line of combat contact, and first let's talk about the Sumy region. As we discussed in the previous videos, the Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation along the entire line, starting from the settlement of Pavlovka and ending with the village by the name of Yunakivka, where there are still very heavy clashes. You know that the Russian sources are saying that there are very heavy clashes in this area, that the Russians are advancing, that Ukrainians are bringing additional forces and reinforcements in this area. But the thing is that since the beginning of the battle for this territory, we haven't seen even a single geolocation, even a single video that can confirm the presence of the Russian forces either in the central part or in the northern part. We have just a very huge contested area, very huge gap between the geolocated Russian positions and the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, and it seems that the Russians have no presence in the area of the village. But anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. At the same time, during the previous days, we continue receiving reports that Ukrainians carry out several successful counterattacks in the area of Kondratovka, Andreevka, and Alexeyevka, and according to this geolocation, according to different others, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over these territories. So the Ukrainians basically launched their counteroffensive somewhere on the 17th or 18th of June of 2025, and by the end of the 23rd of June of 2025, the Ukrainians managed to improve their position significantly. And obviously the Ukrainians are not going to stop, because now the Russians are completely focused on this forest. Something huge the Ukrainians are trying to accumulate on the area of this small forest, most likely with the purpose to continue their counteroffensive operation. For example, during the previous 24 hours, we got this video where we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory with most powerful they have, with FAB 3000 or maybe something additional, maybe like Toslam tower system. As a result of this attack, the Russians try to destroy as many as possible Ukrainian forces exactly in this area. And this is not the only video that we got during the previous 24 hours. This is another video, from another angle, from another, let's say, period of day. The Russians attacked the same forest, most likely with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to begin something. And the most important, if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of this month, we're going to see that the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory many times. Many times, most likely the Ukrainians were planning to start something. So if we return back to map, we're gonna see that the Ukrainians most likely are trying to cut the Russians on the territory of the village of Kondratovka and Koldrun. So let's return back to the 23rd of June of 2025. Let's take a look at the map and let's discuss what exactly may happen in the very near future. Once again, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over the village of Andreevka, and something tells me that the Ukrainians are not going to stop. Most likely the Ukrainians will continue their offensive operation further along the tree lines towards the river and this water reservoir. This is some river on the territory of the northern part of this region, and this is the first possible route to Ukraine attack, and most likely the Ukrainians will try to attack Russian positions from this small forest, also in the eastern direction, trying to get between the villages of Kondratovka and Constantinovka. If the Ukrainians are able to carry out both offensives, this will allow them to cut and colder the Russians on the territory of Kondratovka. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that according to Syrsky and according to his statement about core system, the Ukrainians, some headquarters of some, let's say, corps are already along the line of combat contact. So maybe the Ukrainians are planning to probably restart or to resume or their Sumy counter-offensive operation and to answer the Suji region and the Kursk region once again. Who knows? But anyway, something is happening here. We see that the Russians for some reason stopped their offensive. They are not moving further, and the Ukrainians began their counterattacks. As for now, the Ukrainians are just testing the ground, testing the lines, but if they see that the Russians are not able to hold their lines, obviously the Ukrainians would increase the pressure. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupiansk area or in the Liman direction, where the Ukrainians were forced to fall back from another village. According to information we have, yesterday the Russians managed to secure the village of Grekovka or Petrovska, according to, let's say, former title of this territory, and this information yesterday was confirmed and provided by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, but without any geolocations, without any video that can confirm this. And this day, during the 23rd of June of 2025, the Ukrainians published first geolocations. We are talking about this video, and in this video we can see how Russian drone was flying above the most northern part of the settlement, and in this video we can see how Russian soldiers raised their flag exactly in this area. So this is the moment when two Russian soldiers, very happy Russian soldiers, raised Russian flag in this area, and they were happy basically. And this episode was geolocated, and this is exactly the place where two Russian soldiers raised the Russian flag. So based on this video, we colored the village of Grekovka completely in Russian favor. A small village was taken by the Russians. There are several company strongholds to the northwest of the settlement, and now most likely the Russians will continue their offensive operation through the villages of Novomir and Olgovka, and in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Grekovka, further in the northwestern direction, with the purpose to establish complete control over this pocket and to get for as close as possible to the settlement by the name of Druzhilubovka. This is another offensive operation with the purpose to create strong gap between the Barova direction and the Liman direction, and only then most likely the Russians would continue their offensive operation further in the southern directions towards the city by the name of Liman. Now let's talk about the Sivers direction. The situation remains tense in this area, as several experts call the village of Serebryanka as the gates to the city of Siversk. The Ukrainians currently are sending everything they can with the purpose to stabilize the situation and to force the Russians to fall back from the northeastern part of the village of Serebryanka. Currently there are very heavy clashes for this area, and during the previous days the Ukrainians were attacking Russians from the southwestern direction with the purpose to force the Russians to fall back, but the Russians managed to repel every attack in this area. And as for the 23rd of June of 2025, the Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russians from behind with the purpose to cross the river of Seversky Donetsk and to attack the Russians and to cut them in cauldron. This offensive, this counter-attack of the armored forces of Ukraine was also repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians were forced to fall back. Now we see that most likely the Russians managed to dig in deeper in this area, and now the Russians are going to continue their offensive with the purpose to secure the gates of the city of Seversk. Now let's discuss the situation in the area of the city of Konstantinovka. The most important updates came yesterday from the city of Chasiv. Several pro-Russian resources reported that the city of Chasiv were almost completely secured. When summarizing everything that was stated by several pro-Russian resources regarding the situation in the city of Chasiv, this is approximately the area that is already in a complete Russian control. So according to all these reports, the Russians by the end of the 23rd of June of 2025 established control for more than 95% of the city of Chasiv. The Ukrainians control just around 10-5%, and the Ukrainians continue losing the ground. So the Russians are about to finish the battle for this area, and obviously then they will continue offensive operation further in the southwestern direction with the purpose to secure this dense network of fortifications to the northeast of the city of Konstantinovka. So the next target of the armored force of the Russian Federation is to get as close as possible to the city of Konstantinovka and to tighten the news around positions of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement from the northeast and from the east. But the most important updates as for the previous 24 hours are coming from the most southern part of the Konstantinovka direction. We are talking about the battle for the Klevan-Byk pocket, and obviously the battle for this pocket is coming to an end. As we discussed in the previous videos, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, according to several mappers and several sources, managed to cut the Klevan-Byk pocket in two. So the Russians managed to cut this area around the settlement of Alexander Kalinova and along N20 road. So these are the changes that were shown by different mappers as for the end of the 22nd of June of 2025. And obviously from this perspective, we see that the Russians managed to cut this territory in two, and currently there are two pockets, the pockets of Yablunovka and the pockets of, let's say, the river of Krivoy Terets and the railways between the settlement of New York and Konstantinovka itself. So and the Russians are trying to cut these pockets separately, and obviously the Ukrainians now need to think what pocket has more valuable for the Ukrainians and how to maneuver with resources they have. So as for the 23rd of June of 2025, we can see huge activities of the Russians in the northwestern part of the Kleban of the settlement of Yablunovka. In this video, we can see how Russians were attacking and hunting Ukrainians in this area. They were attacking Ukrainians with mortars, with artillery, with FPV drones. So this area is under very heavy fire, and we see that these strongholds, these company strongholds, are under complete Russian siege and control, fire control. So we expect that the final battle, the major battle for these strongholds are about to start. As for now, the Russians are trying to secure everything with drones, with artillery strikes, with mortar strikes. So once again, the next target of the Russians is to secure these company strongholds that are located in the northwestern part of the village of Yablunovka. As soon as the Russians are able to establish control over this territory, we can state complete collapse of Ukrainian defense and basically the beginning of the battle for the southwestern part of the city of Konstantinovka itself. Furthermore, several pro-Ukrainian sources reported that, first of all, this concerns Yablunovka, which the Russians' armored forces control by 50%. In the Konstantinovka direction, fighting continues on the main defense line. First of all, this concerns Yablunovka, which the Russians' armored forces control by 50%. So, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians have already established complete control over this territory we've just discussed. But as for now, we have no proofs. Nobody has proofs that this is the correct information. So that is why everybody is waiting for additional confirmations and geolocations, and then we're gonna see huge adjustments. But the western flank is not the most important. The battle of Yablunovka is ongoing. There are still lots of job to do. The most interesting updates are coming from the eastern flank of the Klevan-Byk pockets, where the Russians managed to ruin Ukrainian defense. Basically, defense of the armored forces collapsed in this area, and the Russians have already created their first cauldron in this area by cutting lots of Ukrainians in the area of the southern Sherbia Sherbinovka and Novospaskaya. As you can see, we have changes on the ground. Let's take a look and let's compare the maps. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 22nd of June of 2025. The Russians were too far from the village, and this entire territory used to be considered as a complete Ukraine control area. And today we got a very interesting video published by Ukrainian sources, and according to this video we see that the Russians managed to enter the village of Sherbinovka in its northern part from the northwestern part of the city of Toretsk. Let's take a look at this video. And this is the video we're talking about. This video was published by the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and in this video we can see several directions like Nova Lenovka, Nova Ukrainka, and this is the most important episode of this video, and this episode concerns the situation in the area of the village by the name of Sherbinovka. In this video we can see how Ukrainian drone was flying above the settlement of Sherbinovka and how Ukrainian drone was recording the movements of the Russian forces on the territory of the village itself, how Russian stormtroopers were moving from one building to another under very heavy artillery fire of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. So, for example, in this video we can see a Russian soldier that was moving there, and he was moving from one building to another. So there are lots of episodes with a lot of Russian soldiers exactly in this area. So it's not just a video when another Ukraine author claims that he was attacking another building of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation without any visible confirmation of the presence of the Russian forces there. This is real proof that confirms Russian soldiers exactly in this point. So based on this video, most of the mappers by the end of the 23rd of June of 2025 adjusted their maps in Russian favor. And obviously and this is already correct information, the only question that everybody has, how exactly the Russians answered. So most of the mappers adjusted their maps this way, but nobody can tell for sure and nobody can confirm that the Russians haven't answered this territory, let's say, using these roads of attack. So nobody knows. Basically, everybody colored this area using the shortest way how exactly the Russians could get there. And if this is exactly the case, then obviously the Ukrainians who are currently located in this area were caught and cordoned by the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation without any chances for evacuation. Probably they have just small chances, but this is the upcoming night between the 23rd and the 24th of June. This upcoming night, the Ukrainians need to begin evacuation, otherwise they would be caught and cordoned by the Russians without any chances for safe and successful evacuation without losses. Or they will have this chances, but all their evacuation will be probably connected with huge losses from their side. So the Russians began offensive operation in this area. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that the Russians have already established complete FPV drone control over the only evacuation route of 522. Just discussed minutes ago that the Russians cut this territory in two. So the Russians are at the final stage of the battle for the southern Constantinovka direction, for the southern Klevan-Byk pockets. This territory would be taken by the Russians most likely during the next 2 or 3 weeks, and then the battle for the city of Constantinovka begins. And furthermore, don't forget that at the same time the Russians are about to finish the battle for the city of Chasiv Yar, and the Russians are advancing to the northeast of the city. So the Russians are tightening the news and getting closer and closer to the city of Constantinovka. So the major battle may start at the beginning of July of 2025. And most likely, somewhere at the same time, the Ukrainians will try to attack once again deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation with the purpose to ruin Russians' plans. And everything will depend on that. Because if the Russians manage to get additional information and to discover the presence of Ukrainian forces, that will allow them to repel possible Ukrainian attack, to defeat them most likely, and then to continue their own operation. And this can be a turning point in the military campaign of 2025. Now let's talk about the Dnipropetrovsk direction. The Russians continue their offensive, and today we see that the Russians are trying to attack the village, the settlement of Udachne from the south. Exactly from this area, we are recording updates almost every single day since the 20th of June of 2025. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 21st of June. This is the situation by the end of the 22nd of June of 2025. The Russians managed to secure tree lines and fields to the southwest of Udachne, and by the end of the 23rd of June, the Russians improved their positions once again. So from this perspective, we see that the Russians are trying to get these three lines, and then using these three lines, the Russians are going to move in the northern direction with the purpose to cut the village of Molodetska from the settlement of Udachne and to outflank the settlement of Udachne and to get the Dnipro-Petrovsk region from this area as well, and to establish control over the village settlement of Udachne. So the Russians are trying to intensify their offensive activities, and most likely they will continue during the next several days. This is a very important settlement of Udachne. This is a very huge logistic hub that can be used by the Russians to accumulate their forces before further offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Sergeyevka, which is a very important logistic hub for the armed forces of Ukraine in the area of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. I would like to remind you that during the previous days, the Russians were attacking Ukrainians in the area of Novoekonomichne, and several very reliable pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians entered the northeastern part, and now it's time for the Russians to begin offensive in the direction of Sergeyevka. This operation can allow the Russians to encircle the Ukrainians, or to cut Ukrainians in cauldron in the area of the city of Pokrovsk. So this battle also has begun at the same time with the Russian offensive in the direction of Konstantinovka. We see that the Russians are trying to save both towns, both cities, to save as many as possible structures, villages. This will allow the Russians, and not just the Russians, but this will allow civilians to return back to the settlements after the end of the war. As for the Pavlovka direction, we still have some questions about and doubts about the situation in this pocket. We have huge gap, as you can see, between the settlement of Andreevka and the village of Pavlovka. We're talking about this contested area. It's unclear whether there are Ukrainians or not, but today we start receiving very interesting videos from this area. We received lots of videos in the past exactly from this direction, but when talking about the previous period of the battle for this area, we were receiving mainly the videos of FPV drone attacks. If you remember, the Russians were attacking these fields, these three lines with FPV drones. They were attacking Ukrainians that were trying to evacuate themselves and to evacuate and to escape this cauldron. And now we start receiving videos of how the Russians are bombing and attacking this territory with artillery strikes and with multiple launch rocket systems, which means that the Russians changed the quality of weapon they use. So they used to use drones to attack vehicles, and now they start using multiple launch rocket systems. Most likely this can mean several things. Either the Russians are planning to begin their major offensive operation with the purpose to cut this pocket completely, and all these strikes were nothing just like artillery preparation before the beginning of a major offensive, let's say from the south and from the north to this area, let's say like this, to attack from the area of Zaporizhia and to attack from the area of Goryokhova, or the Russians see that the Ukrainians began massive evacuation of their troops from this pocket in the direction of Novopavlovka. Not just several vehicles a day, but hundreds of soldiers are trying to escape this area. So that is why the Russians began bombing and attacking this territory with multiple launch rocket systems with the purpose to increase the losses of Ukrainians during the evacuation. So we expect that this pocket will collapse also during the next several days. The Russians continue their offensive in the direction of Yalta, and there are still very heavy clashes on the outskirts. The Russians preparing the village before the beginning of a major battle. As for now, we see that the Russians managed to destroy several probably temporary deployment points or main strongholds around the settlement with the purpose to ease the progress of the Russians in the future. Furthermore, the Russians continue concentration of their forces on the Ukrainian side of the river of Mokre Yali. The Russians, after they finished the battle for Perobudova, tried to improve their positions, tried to improve their logistics, tried to build pontoon bridges, and after they finish the process, they will continue offensive operation in the direction of the village of Mirne. As for the Zaporizhia direction, currently the main clashes are taking place on the line between Shevchenko and Voskresenka. The Russians reported that they managed to improve their positions in the fields between Voskresenka and Vesole. In this video we can see final episodes of battle for the stronghold, very huge stronghold, as you can see, that was created and prepared by the Ukrainians. And in this video we can see how Russians using drones were securing this territory, and the sources reported that these strongholds were already taken by the Russians. So let's wait and see for additional geolocations. But according to information we have, the Russians are trying to get as close as possible to the road between Voskresenka and Shevchenko and to cut supplies for Ukrainians. As for now, there are very heavy clashes on the territory of Shevchenko, and according to different sources, by the end of the 23rd of June of 2025, the Russians secured up to 60% of the settlement, and the Russians continue offensive. The Ukrainians during the previous days tried to send as many as possible reinforcements and reserves in the direction of the Shevchenko with the purpose to stabilize the situation, but everything that came to very close to Russian positions, very close to a line of combat contact, was destroyed by the Russian FPV drone fire. The sources reported that very interesting updates are going to come to us in the very near future from the Zaporizhia direction. Most likely the sources are saying about the settlement of Malinovka, which is about to be taken by the Russians. We see that the Russians intensify their artillery strikes and missile strikes in the north and in the northwestern part of the settlement. Sources reported that the turning point of the battle for the area has already been passed by the Russians and the Ukrainians. And when talking about the Zaporizhia direction, we got lots of updates from the settlement of Kamenskaya. The source reported that the Russians are about to begin another wave of offensive operation in this area as well, and the Russians most likely will try to secure the village of Kamenskaya completely and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. As for now, these significant activities of Russian aviation and Russian forces is recorded in this area, so we are waiting for additional changes once again. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.